Hey everybody, welcome to our Leadership Community e-trainings. We're going through a series titled 7 Steps to Creating a Disciple-Making Culture. And we have actually moved through the first 3 of those steps, which focus on individual behaviors, everything from defining your destination, in other words, having some clarity around where you're trying to take people, to moving people beyond the Sunday crowd. If we know what we're trying to do and where we're trying to take people, then we have to understand what's the best method for getting them there, and that is to move people beyond the public space into more relational spaces. And then the third step is, once we get them in those relational spaces, we've got to make sure we're doing the right the right things. In other words, having the right kind of dynamics happening in those relational spaces. So we call that one raising the spiritual temperature. Now today we're going to move from those more individual behaviors to some more organizational behaviors and begin to see how the dots connect. So we're going to go through speaking a common language. That'll be today, and then in the future celebrating disciple-making values, engaging best practices, and leveraging the power of culture. But I want you to kind of see the overview of where we're going in this series and how you actually develop a culture that makes disciples. Now, what do we mean when in step 4 we say speaking a common language? Let me give you just a simple illustration. If you were to take the Kansas City Chiefs playbook and switch it with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers playbook, you would have had mass chaos before the Super Bowl. And why is that? Because you're mixing languages. You're confusing people with different terminology, with different ideas and axioms that you use on a football field. So you want to get everybody speaking the same language so that we're all moving in the same direction together rather than, at cross forces. A good example here of how culture gets shaped came from Dan Malarski, who heads up our men's ministry. And I think at one of their retreats, they actually had a devotional on the parable of the talents. And somebody gave a devotional and used the language, don't be a one-bagger. In other words, the one-bagger, there's a guy that had the one talent and he went and he buried it in the sand and didn't use it because he was afraid his master would be upset with him. And yet that little phrase, don't be a one-bagger, resonated with people. It kind of captured their imagination. It went viral and people began using it. I asked him, I said, have you made t-shirts yet? Because that's the next step. Once it's gone viral deep enough, people start printing up t-shirts. Don't be a one-bagger. When you begin to see language like that being repeated and pervasively throughout an organization, you've got a good organization. Now I want to give you 2 categories in which you can begin to see how this works itself out in very practical ways. First of all, the ministry axioms that we repeat, and then secondly, in the key theological terms that we employ. Let's look first at some of the axioms that we repeat in ministry. And when I say axioms, it might be helpful to think in terms of the genre of proverbs. You know what a proverb is? It comes from the Latin proverba, which means 4 words. Instead of a whole lot of words, I'm going to compress them in just to a handful of words, an economy of words that hopefully will stick in the mind because they're memorable, and they'll spur the will because they're motivational. So for instance, you have an English proverb like a stitch in time, saves 9. In other words, if you repair something before the damage is too great, you can save yourself a lot of time, right? It sticks in the mind, it spurs the will. There's another Chinese proverb that I love that goes like this: he who lies down with dogs will get up with fleas. In other words, we tend to unconsciously take on the characteristics of the people that we associate or are close to. Now, let me give you some axioms that we use in our ministry here at New Community. Many of these are found on page 35 of your group life playbook, but I'm just going to state them and then kind of illustrate them for you. Axiom number 1, life change is catalyzed from the pulpit, but it's maximized in relationships. Now think about that for a second. It sticks in the mind. It's got that genre of proverba. Instead of a whole lot of words, it's kind of compressed into a pithy little sentence. Life change is catalyzed from the pulpit, but it is maximized in relationships. It sticks in the mind, it kind of spurs the will. And it's illustrated by Jesus's model of disciple making, which we've been looking at here over the course of this ministry year. And it is a simple reminder that Jesus moved beyond the public context where he was speaking to hundreds of people to a more relational context. Why? Because he realized that life change is catalyzed from the pulpit, but it's maximized in relationships. We understand that you can catalyze a group, you can inspire a group with words and concepts and ideas, but you actually internalize character formation through imitation, through integrity, life on life, close in on relationships. You remember we did this experience, we called it the 3 questions exercise, in which we said, name 3 sermons that have brought you closer to Jesus. Name 3 experiences that have brought you closer to Jesus. And 3 people who have brought you closer to Jesus. And you remember, this has been field tested quite broadly by thousands of people. And the experience is pretty universal. Everyone struggles to come up with the 3 sermons. The experiences are a lot easier, and the people are the easiest of all. Why? Because life change is catalyzed from a pulpit, but it is maximized, you see, through life-on-life relationships. It underscores the priority of relationships, and that's why we say we've got to move people beyond the public context, beyond the Sunday morning experience, into life-on-life relationships down here in the social, personal, and intimate spaces. So a good way you could apply that would be do that with your small group. Give them the 3-question exercise, and then punctuate it with this axiom, and use their own examples and life stories to kind of drive it home. Life change is catalyzed from the pulpit, but it's maximized in relationships. Let me give you a second one under axioms or ministry axioms. Discipleship that is deeper and more durable is more effortful. Now, one of the dynamics that I've observed in watching our small groups over the years is that there is a tendency for all of us to be co-opted into the easiest common denominator by the group pressure, okay? And this applies to everything from curriculum selection, where we will easily gravitate to the easiest curriculum that is the least demanding, and yet that will produce the least in terms of real discipleship. So for instance, going to watch a video, pretty easy, you see, as opposed to doing Discovery Bible Method, which requires you to do some homework, to ask some questions, to take some notes, to engage in a process of give and take with other people. That's a little more demanding, but it's also much more fruitful, and the reason is why? Because discipleship that's deeper and more durable is more effortful. Same thing applies to meeting frequency. You might remember at our halftime midterm huddles, several people mentioned that they were struck by how meeting every week was actually much more effective in the dynamics of their group. Why is that? Because discipleship that is deeper and more durable is more effortful, right? Another little axiom that we use that really kind of is a subcategory here is that the most important thing that happens to your group is what happens outside of the group time. In other words, when you move outside of that weekly or 3 out of 4 week hour and a half meeting, when you add a dinner event to add some social and fun time together, when you meet individuals for lunch, when you do a serving project together, when you make a midweek call, when you know someone's going through a rough time and you just call them to say, hey, I've been praying for you, I wanted to see how you're doing, what happened this week, when you write a note of encouragement, all those things you see begin to add up over time and are much more effective dynamics in producing disciples. Why? Because discipleship that is deeper and more durable is more effortful. Well, those are a couple examples around what we would call ministry axioms, okay? Crisp ideas that will stick in the mind and spur the will. And I would encourage you over the rest of this semester to look for opportunities to actually do those in your groups, apply those, teach those, and see if we can get even more momentum going around our discipleship initiative. Now, let me switch from axioms to key terms that we communicate around the gospel. And you might do this as an exercise. You could hand out 4x6 cards and say, write down your definition of the gospel. And then let everybody just kind of, share their definition. You could point out, if you've done the exercise first, you've probably done this too. All of us kind of miss it, until we really begin thinking about words and thinking about biblical definitions. And so most people are going to give you a definition something like this. Well, the gospel is that Jesus died for my sins, and if I ask him into my life, I go to heaven when I die. We call that the forgiveness-only gospel. And there are other, what we would call competing gospels in our culture, the prosperity gospel, the gospel of the left. I'm talking about the religious left here, that's concerned about just doing good to others. It's a good thing to do, but again, when you make part of the truth, all the truth, it becomes an untruth. The consumer gospel, which is, what's in it for me? Now, what all of those competing gospels have in common is what? Discipleship is not a part of it, which is significant. They are all self-focused on me, myself, and I. And remember this, talking about axioms, that shape our ministry. The gospel that you believe in and preach will determine the disciples that you make. So if you are communicating, even unconsciously, a forgiveness-only gospel or a consumer gospel, probably the two major ones in our culture, you're going to produce a non-discipleship culture. But when you preach the gospel that Jesus preached, what we call the kingdom gospel or the discipleship gospel, just because that language tends to get people's attention, what happens is you begin to rethink and you begin to flesh out your definition of the gospel in more biblical terms. Let me give you another example with the word disciple. You could do the same exercise. Have people write out, what is a disciple of Jesus? And then go back and share with them my favorite definition of a disciple, which comes right out of the teaching of Jesus, Matthew chapter 4, verse 19. Jesus says this, he says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." So, according to Jesus, a disciple is one who has come and followed Jesus, is being changed by Jesus, and is on mission for Jesus. Notice, come follow me, following Jesus. I will make you. You're being changed by Jesus. And thirdly, you're a fisher of men because you're making fishers of men. It's not enough to be conformed to the, quote, character of Jesus. You must also be conformed to the mission of Jesus. That's what he calls us to do in that verse. I think the typical pastor and the typical person in the pews thinks that discipleship is simply getting together with another believer and deepening their biblical knowledge. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's actually a good thing, but it's missing the focus. It's a little misguided. It fails to understand Jesus' definition of a disciple, which is a fisher of men, which means that true discipleship, biblical discipleship, has to be a specific sequential strategy that moves people to where they become disciples who are making other disciples. In other words, there's a built-in replication of helping people grow to maturity, not just in the character, but also in the mission of Jesus. According to Jesus, there's no such thing as a disciple or a Christian, because those terms are totally interchangeable. There is no such thing as a disciple who is not involved in the discipleship of other people. Now, that's why we use the 4 chairs. We introduced it to you way back in the fall, in which we try to help people move through the 4 chairs, because the 4th chair is to come and reproduce. First you come and see, then you come and follow, and then you come and be with Jesus. Why? So that you can reproduce Jesus in the lives of other people. Well, I hope this will be helpful to you as you think about the importance of our language, that we all get in the habit of learning these axioms and putting them to use in ministry, teaching them, explaining them, pointing them out when you see them in the culture, where we start to use the same gospel terms and the same kinds of definitions. And if you really want to put down some roots in this, what I would encourage you to do is join us on April 23rd and 24th for a deep dive conference. We're going to bring Bill Hall in, who we've quoted extensively throughout this Rediscovering Discipleship series. And he's going to be with us for Friday evening, Saturday morning, and really help us to get real clarity around some of these key gospel terms that I think will really help take you to a whole new level of discipleship. So let me encourage you, before we get together next month, to use some of these exercises that we've talked about to help all of us get on the same page and speak the same language.